For decades, Harvey Weinstein was considered untouchable. He wasn't just another Hollywood producer. He was one of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry, capable of launching careers, winning Academy Awards, and deciding who would become the next big star. Actors wanted to work with him. Studios depended on him. Executives feared him. But behind the glamour, luxury hotels, red carpets, and Oscar celebrations, prosecutors say another story was unfolding, one that would remain hidden for years. That story would eventually trigger one of the biggest cultural movements in modern history. And nearly a decade later, after multiple trials, overturned convictions, deadlocked juries, and years of emotional courtroom battles, prosecutors have finally made a decision that may close one of the last remaining chapters of Harvey Weinstein's criminal cases in New York. He will not face a fourth rape trial. For some, the announcement represents the end of an exhausting legal battle. For others, it leaves difficult questions about justice, trauma, and the limits of the criminal justice system. This is the story of how one of Hollywood's most powerful men fell from the very top, and why one of the final accusations against him will never be heard by another New York jury. Long before his name became synonymous with scandal, Harvey Weinstein was regarded as one of the most influential figures in the film industry. Together with his brother Bob, he co-founded Miramax Films, a company that transformed independent cinema into an Oscar-winning powerhouse. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Miramax produced critically acclaimed films including Pulp Fiction, Shakespeare in Love, The English Patient, Good Will Hunting, Chicago, and many others. Winning an Academy Award often meant winning Harvey Weinstein's approval. Inside Hollywood, people frequently referred to him as the Kingmaker. His aggressive Oscar campaigns became legendary. Studios competed with him. Directors respected him. Young actors desperately wanted meetings with him. But numerous women would later tell investigators that these meetings often followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Many said they believed they were attending business discussions about acting opportunities or film projects. Instead, prosecutors say those meetings sometimes became situations where Weinstein allegedly used his influence to pressure women into unwanted sexual encounters. For years, very few people spoke publicly. Some feared retaliation. Others believed no one would ever challenge one of Hollywood's most powerful executives. Several women later said they worried their careers would be destroyed if they reported what had happened. That silence would last for decades. Everything changed in 2017. Investigative journalists published detailed reports containing allegations from multiple women who accused Weinstein of sexual misconduct. Almost overnight, more women began sharing similar experiences. The number continued to grow. Dozens became scores. Eventually, more than 80 women publicly accused Weinstein of misconduct ranging from harassment to sexual assault. Among them were actresses, production assistants, aspiring performers, and former employees. The allegations shocked Hollywood. Within days, Weinstein was fired from his own company. Industry organizations expelled him. Friends distanced themselves. Awards were revoked. Perhaps most significantly, countless women around the world began sharing their own experiences of workplace harassment using two simple words: Me Too. The movement had existed before, but the Weinstein allegations transformed it into a global conversation. Millions of survivors came forward. Governments changed workplace policies. Corporations rewrote harassment procedures. Powerful public figures faced renewed scrutiny. The entertainment industry was forced to confront accusations that had been ignored for years. Harvey Weinstein quickly became the symbol of that reckoning. As investigators reviewed allegations from multiple women, prosecutors focused on several criminal cases they believed could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. One of those women was Jessica Mann. Unlike many people who knew only the headlines, Jessica's story would become one of the most legally complicated cases in Weinstein's long series of criminal trials. She had once hoped to build a career as an actress. According to her testimony, she met Weinstein through industry connections while trying to establish herself in New York. She described a relationship that prosecutors argued was marked by manipulation, intimidation, and enormous power imbalance. The defense, however, argued something very different. They claimed the relationship had been consensual. That disagreement would become one of the central questions presented to multiple juries over several years. According to prosecutors, in 2013, Jessica Mann was raped by Weinstein inside a Manhattan hotel. Weinstein has consistently denied that allegation. His lawyers have repeatedly argued that every sexual encounter between them was consensual. Because there were no independent eyewitnesses, the case depended heavily on testimony, credibility, communications between the two, and how jurors interpreted the evidence. Those issues would divide juries again and again. In 2020, Harvey Weinstein faced his first major criminal trial in New York. The courtroom became the center of international attention. Television cameras gathered outside every morning. Reporters from around the world filled the courthouse. Witnesses described emotional testimony that sometimes lasted for days. Jessica Mann spent nearly a week explaining her relationship with Weinstein and recounting what prosecutors alleged happened inside that hotel room. Another woman, former production assistant Miriam Haley, also testified that Weinstein sexually assaulted her in 2006. After weeks of testimony and deliberations, the jury reached its verdict. Harvey Weinstein was convicted. He received a sentence of 23 years in prison. Many believed the verdict marked a historic moment. Supporters of the #MeToo movement celebrated what they saw as long overdue accountability. Others viewed the conviction as proof that even the most powerful individuals could eventually face justice. But the legal battle was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. Years later, New York's highest court would overturn that conviction, ruling that the original trial had been unfair because jurors heard testimony from women whose allegations were not directly tied to the criminal charges being tried. The decision did not declare Weinstein innocent. Instead, it required prosecutors to try the case again under different legal rules. That ruling set the stage for years of retrials, deadlocked juries, and emotional courtroom battles that would ultimately lead to an unexpected decision in June 2026. And at the center of it all remained one unanswered question. Would any jury ever unanimously agree on Jessica Mann's rape allegation? When New York's highest court overturned Harvey Weinstein's 2020 conviction, the decision sent shockwaves through the legal world. To many survivors, it felt like history was repeating itself. Years of testimony, emotional courtroom appearances, and what many believed had been a landmark victory suddenly disappeared with a single judicial ruling. But legally, the court's decision was not a declaration of innocence. The judges concluded that the original trial had been unfair because prosecutors were allowed to introduce testimony from women whose allegations were not part of the criminal charges before the jury. According to the court, that evidence may have improperly influenced jurors by encouraging them to view Weinstein as someone with a general pattern of misconduct, rather than focusing only on the crimes charged in the indictment. The ruling erased the conviction, but it also gave prosecutors another opportunity. Instead of ending the case, Manhattan prosecutors announced they intended to try Weinstein again. For Jessica Mann, that meant returning to court. For Harvey Weinstein, it meant another chance to defend himself. And for everyone involved, it meant reliving years of painful memories. By the time the retrial began, Weinstein was no longer the powerful producer who once walked Hollywood's red carpets. He appeared in court in a wheelchair. His lawyers repeatedly argued that his health had significantly deteriorated. Still, prosecutors insisted that age and declining health did not erase allegations of serious crimes. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was familiar. Jessica Mann once again took the witness stand. She described her relationship with Weinstein in detail. Jurors heard about meetings, phone calls, hotel rooms, and the emotional confusion she said followed those encounters. Prosecutors argued that Weinstein had used his enormous influence over aspiring actresses to manipulate and control women who feared damaging their careers. The defense offered an entirely different picture. Defense attorneys pointed to continued communication between Mann and Weinstein after the alleged assault. They highlighted emails, messages, and meetings that occurred in the months afterward. According to the defense, those communications demonstrated an ongoing consensual relationship rather than criminal conduct. Prosecutors responded that trauma does not always produce predictable behavior. Experts have long explained that survivors of sexual violence sometimes continue communicating with their alleged abusers for many different reasons, including fear, professional pressure, emotional confusion, or attempts to regain control of difficult situations. Ultimately, jurors were asked to decide whose explanation they believed. The retrial produced mixed results. The jury unanimously convicted Weinstein of sexually abusing former production assistant Miriam Haley. At the same time, all jurors acquitted him on another charge involving former model Kaja Sokolow. But when it came to Jessica Mann's allegation, they simply could not agree. Some jurors believed prosecutors had proven the case. Others remained unconvinced beyond a reasonable doubt. Days passed. The judge encouraged further deliberations. Still, the disagreement continued. Finally, the jury informed the court that it was hopelessly deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial on the rape charge connected to Jessica Mann. That meant there was no conviction, but there was also no acquittal. Legally, prosecutors still had the option of trying the case again. Many observers expected the Manhattan District Attorney's Office to move forward. They did exactly that. A third New York trial focusing on Jessica Mann's allegation was scheduled. For Mann, it meant preparing once again to describe deeply personal experiences before strangers. It meant facing cross-examination once more. It meant returning to a courtroom where every word would be challenged. By then, nearly a decade had passed since the alleged assault. The emotional burden had only grown heavier. During the third trial, both sides largely repeated the arguments they had presented before. Prosecutors argued that Weinstein had exploited his position as one of Hollywood's most powerful producers. They said Jessica Mann had been manipulated by someone who controlled opportunities she desperately hoped to receive. The defense maintained that prosecutors were attempting to criminalize a complicated adult relationship. Again, jurors reviewed messages, testimony, travel records, and witness accounts. Again, they debated credibility. Again, they struggled to reach unanimity. Inside the jury room, opinions remained deeply divided. After extended deliberations, jurors informed the judge that further discussions were unlikely to change anyone's mind. For the second time regarding Jessica Mann's allegation, a mistrial was declared. The same question remained unanswered. Had prosecutors proven the charge beyond a reasonable doubt? No unanimous jury could say yes, but neither could one unanimously say no. Outside the courthouse, reactions reflected the nation's continuing debate over sexual assault prosecutions. Supporters of Jessica Mann argued that repeated retrials were re-traumatizing survivors, while highlighting how difficult it can be to prove sexual assault cases that often rely heavily on testimony rather than physical evidence years after the alleged events. Others believed prosecutors had an obligation to continue pursuing justice if they believed sufficient evidence existed. Defense supporters argued that repeated prosecutions placed unfair pressure on defendants after multiple juries failed to reach unanimous verdicts. The legal system had become trapped between two competing principles. One demanded accountability. The other demanded certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. Neither side appeared willing to surrender. Behind the scenes, prosecutors faced an increasingly difficult decision. Should they ask Jessica Mann to testify yet again? Another trial would require months of preparation, additional interviews, more court appearances. Another round of cross-examination, another emotional return to one of the most painful periods of her life. Meanwhile, Weinstein remained imprisoned on other convictions and continued serving his California sentence while awaiting sentencing in New York for the Miriam Haley conviction. Even if prosecutors secured another conviction involving Jessica Mann, Weinstein was unlikely to walk free in the foreseeable future. The practical value of another trial became increasingly uncertain. But for survivors, the question had never been only about prison time. It was also about being heard, about accountability, about having a jury reach a final decision. That decision, however, would ultimately belong to someone else, Jessica Mann herself. And in June 2026, after years of courtroom battles, she reached a conclusion that would bring one of the longest-running chapters of the Harvey Weinstein saga to an end. On June 25, 2026, the legal battle took an unexpected turn. After years of investigations, multiple trials, countless hours of testimony and repeated courtroom appearances, Manhattan prosecutors announced that they would no longer pursue another trial against Harvey Weinstein over Jessica Mann's rape allegation. The judge formally dismissed the remaining charge. For the first time in years, there would be no new trial date, no jury selection, no opening statements, no cross-examination. The case had finally reached its end. But the reason had little to do with a lack of evidence. Instead, it reflected something far more personal. Jessica Mann had decided she could not go through another trial. In a letter read aloud in court by prosecutors, Mann explained why she had reached that decision. She wrote that after years of legal proceedings, she no longer had the emotional strength to relive the experience once again. She said she had spent years returning to the witness stand, answering deeply personal questions and revisiting one of the most painful periods of her life. According to her statement, another trial would only prolong that suffering. She explained that she had carefully reflected on the decision before concluding that it was finally time to move forward with her life. Her words carried enormous emotional weight. For many survivors watching the case, the letter reflected a reality that often receives little attention. Criminal trials can be emotionally exhausting. Every hearing requires witnesses to revisit painful memories. Every cross-examination challenges credibility. Every delay extends uncertainty. By the time the fourth possible trial approached, Jessica Mann had already spent years participating in one of the most closely watched criminal cases in modern American history. For her, enough was enough. Inside the courtroom, Harvey Weinstein showed little visible emotion. According to reporters, he maintained a neutral expression as court officers escorted him away in his wheelchair. His attorneys welcomed the dismissal. Throughout every trial, they had insisted that Weinstein had done nothing criminal and that all sexual encounters with Jessica Mann had been consensual. They argued that prosecutors repeatedly failed to convince unanimous juries because the evidence simply did not establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. From their perspective, the dismissal marked the end of an allegation that should never have resulted in repeated prosecutions. Prosecutors viewed the outcome differently. Although they respected Jessica Mann's decision, they emphasized that the dismissal should not be interpreted as a declaration of innocence. Instead, they acknowledged the enormous emotional burden placed upon victims who participate in lengthy criminal proceedings. The dismissal closed only one chapter. Harvey Weinstein's legal problems were far from over. He remained convicted in New York for the sexual abuse of former production assistant Miriam Haley. That conviction still carried the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. In addition, Weinstein continued serving a prison sentence stemming from his California conviction involving another sexual assault case. Although he continued appealing aspects of his California case, he remained incarcerated. At 74 years old, the once powerful movie executive now spent his days behind prison walls rather than inside Hollywood boardrooms. The transformation was extraordinary. Just a decade earlier, Weinstein had been surrounded by celebrities, filmmakers, and studio executives. Today, his public appearances occurred almost exclusively inside courtrooms. Yet the story of Harvey Weinstein extends beyond one individual. His downfall fundamentally changed conversations around power, abuse, and accountability. Before 2017, many allegations involving influential figures were often dismissed, ignored, or quietly settled. After the Weinstein investigations became public, countless women across multiple industries began sharing similar experiences. The phrase "Me Too" spread around the world. Major corporations rewrote workplace policies. Film studios established new reporting systems. Governments reviewed harassment laws. Companies introduced mandatory training programs. Powerful public figures faced investigations that may never have occurred before. Supporters of the movement argue that Weinstein's prosecution demonstrated that wealth and influence should not place anyone above the law. Critics, however, have raised concerns about balancing accountability with defendants' rights to fair trials and due process. Those debates continue today. The Jessica Mann case also highlighted another difficult question. What happens when justice itself becomes emotionally overwhelming? Unlike television courtroom dramas, real criminal trials often unfold over many years. Witnesses may testify more than once. Appeals can erase previous verdicts. Retrials can force survivors to relive traumatic events repeatedly. For Jessica Mann, the legal process lasted nearly a decade. Regardless of how people interpret the outcome, few would dispute that the experience required extraordinary endurance. Her decision not to continue was deeply personal. Some viewed it as heartbreaking. Others saw it as understandable. Either way, it marked the conclusion of one of the most complicated legal battles connected to the hashtag #MeToo era. Harvey Weinstein will never face a fourth New York rape trial, but history is unlikely to remember him because of that final legal decision alone. Instead, his name has become permanently linked to one of the most significant cultural shifts of the 21st century. His rise represented extraordinary power. His downfall exposed how that power could allegedly be abused. His trials forced courts, juries, lawmakers, employers, and the public to confront uncomfortable questions about influence, consent, credibility, and justice. Even now, years after the first allegations became public, those conversations continue. The legal proceedings may finally be ending. The courtroom battles may be over. But the impact of the Harvey Weinstein case is likely to be felt for generations. It changed Hollywood. It changed workplaces. It changed how survivors are heard. And it changed how society views power itself. Whether one sees the final dismissal as an incomplete search for justice or the appropriate conclusion to years of legal proceedings, one fact is undeniable. The Harvey Weinstein case became far more than the story of one man. It became the story of a movement that reshaped the world.